human rights is not something that we should leave to, a sort of remote institutional framework. It's not something that has to be institutionalized. It has to be something which is part of our own individual genetical makeup. It is one of the prime tasks of the European Union and indeed the European Parliament to stand up for human rights and not only and make sure that it's not only a paper declaration, but that they become a reality for the citizens of Europe and the wider world.
The 10th of December, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the principles document, was passed by the General Assembly. There were no negative votes. There were 8 abstentions, all Soviet bloc nations and apartheid South Africa. Credit must be given to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for bringing the topic of human rights to the forefront of our social and political conscience and stimulating the growth of so many effective human rights organizations. Within today's Millennium Development Goals, it is proper that we question the success of the Universal Declaration and its relevancy in this complex global society that we live in today. Indeed, much has changed since the UDHR was conceived. Some change has been for the better. Some change during these years, however, have been for the worst. Every day, thousands, no, millions of humans suffer abuse of their rights and dignity. Every year, thousands are imprisoned or even murdered for defending those rights. But it is a fight that must be waged and won. Let me remind you of something that my grandmother used to say over and over. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. She lived by that principle, and each of us who believe in human rights must commit ourselves to that very simple statement.
It should not be forgotten that the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man had been predating the Universal Declaration by more than 6 months. The Universal Declaration led the groundwork, but it worked also as the inspiration for those who had been drafting new treaty texts. The Declaration would not only survive as a real foundation if states would not be willing to transform and develop the content into a legally binding fashion and expand substance and define better the application of it. We have to acknowledge we need to look at how we teach and what we teach. And we need to go broader. We need to include into our teaching not just the text, but also the dependencies to other areas. When we look back at the text, I think we should look at what at that moment in time the mothers and the fathers had in mind, and now 60 years later what we see. And when I had been talking about inspiration, acknowledgement, but also support to all those who had been developing the system.
Human Rights First has engaged in coalition with other US-based NGOs to advocate the adoption of new legislation that would strengthen the federal and local law enforcement response to hate crime. Governments across the region clearly need to do more to stem the threat that violent hate crimes pose to their societies. Law enforcement officials should ensure that every violent crime with a suspected bias motivation is carefully investigated and properly processed in courts. Members of the European Parliament also have an important role to play in holding government officials accountable for their human rights commitment to protect people from discrimination. Violent hate crimes are a serious human rights problem that affect the lives of thousands across Europe. Governments must ensure that impunity for bias-motivated violence or complacency in the face of it has no place in today's Europe.
States have a duty to protect their people from criminal terrorist acts. by taking effective measures to prevent and to end terrorist attacks. Respect for human rights and the rule of law is vital for any effective policy to halt and prevent terrorism. What the EU can definitely not do is continue to stay silent, continue to bury its head in the sand and just wish the issue could go away. There are loads of roads and ways that EU could try to develop preventive actions, help establish the truth, and acknowledge to its citizens and to the world that maybe it needs also to question itself about its role.
If you think of where the Universal Declaration came from, it came from an obligation, a duty, a need to counter extremism, to deal with emergencies on a scale that we haven't seen since. And so this idea that somehow human rights are an obstacle to countering terrorism is absurd. Human rights are designed to deal with issues that terrorism throws up. So any counterterrorism strategy has to be compatible with human rights standards. The state is under an obligation to protect us, and the state has clear positive obligations to take all reasonable, and that's the important word here, all reasonable measures to ensure, for example, our right to life, but others of our human rights are protected, and therefore states have an obligation in international human rights law to create a counterterrorism strategy. And so a state that doesn't have a counterterrorism strategy will be failing in its international human rights treaty obligations. And counterterrorism strategies that are not compatible with human rights will not be effective, and they will not make us safer.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still very topical, and that this declaration is still very topical as regards the European Human Rights Court case law. European Society against taking the anti-terrorist struggle too far. The supreme jurisdictions of the member states and of the Union have a role to play, and case law does play a role, and in a state of law they are of extremely great importance in making sure that fundamental rights and the state of law are properly upheld.
The Council of Europe and the court in Strasbourg are able to raise a question that the European Union can't deal with yet. That is to say, the rights of the individual vis-à-vis the power of the state. Now, even today, the European Union doesn't have an effective mechanism whereby it can oblige its own member states to respect fundamental rights and freedoms, either in political terms or in legal terms. We have to provide ourselves with instruments, which we have when it comes to enlargement. The candidate countries, the countries that want to accede to the European Union, there the mechanisms have proved very effective in imposing respect of some rules, compliance with rules. But once the country's in, well, that's it. The European Union is closed, and this possibility of having this influence on a member state ceases to exist. So in the current institutional context, it's very difficult because sometimes you don't even have the legal basis to defend human rights. Not completely, of course, but I'm just talking about the fact that at political level, the European Union is very weak when it comes to ensuring that human rights are respected.
Celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it is more valid than 60 years ago, what is written in there, because we have got used to a slight erosion of these civil liberties and human rights which are declared there. There is a core interest of dedicated people into human rights and civil liberties, and actually how do they develop, how much are they still worth to us. Today, using the 60th anniversary, I think it couldn't be any better day to kick off our civil liberties campaign. We wanted to give you at least an insight, because of course we want it transported. And I said it's not advocating for us as a group, it's advocating for liberty within a time where security has the most focus. But one should never forget is that security serves liberty and not vice versa.